In the long centuries before antibiotics, before microscopes turned invisible enemies into names and sketches, there were diseases people expected. Fever came with the swampy air of summer. Coughs arrived with winter smoke. Pox and plague belonged to God's calendar, like storms. But rabies felt different. It didn't fall from the sky or seep from the ground. It came on 4 legs. It looked you in the eyes. It lived inside something familiar, something that slept near the hearth, that followed children through muddy streets, that wagged its tail at the sound of a voice. And then, with one sudden flash of teeth, the ordinary world split open. Picture a small town at the edge of a forest in the late 1700s. The day is bright, the air smells like cut grass and dung and bread cooling on a windowsill. A boy runs barefoot over packed earth, chasing a hoop with a stick. A dog, maybe someone's dog, maybe no one's, paces nearby, thin as a question mark, ribs showing under dusty fur. At first it keeps its distance, head low, eyes too alert. Then it stiffens. Not in the normal way a dog stiffens at a stranger, but in a strange mechanical way, as if something inside it has tightened like a rope. It snaps at air. It circles. It lunges at a chicken, misses, bites the ground, bites the empty space again like it's fighting a ghost. People shout. Someone throws a stone. The dog spins, foam bright at its mouth, and in that blur of panic, it sees the boy and charges. The bite is quick, almost anticlimactic. Teeth sink into skin, calf, hand, forearm, wherever fear puts flesh closest. The boy screams and falls. The dog is beaten away with sticks. It bolts down an alley, slipping between barrels and baskets, vanishing into the town like a curse that knows the map. For a moment, the wound is just a wound. Blood, torn cloth, a mother's shaking hands. Someone says, "It's nothing," because humans need that sentence to stand upright. Someone else says, "That dog was mad," and the air changes. The word mad doesn't mean angry. It means something older, something supernatural, something infectious. It means the bite didn't just break skin, it opened a door. In the 1700s and 1800s, rabies was often called hydrophobia, fear of water, not because people were ignorant, but because they were observant. They didn't know about viruses yet, but they knew what it looked like when the disease finally declared itself. They knew that a person could become thirsty and still recoil from the cup. They knew that swallowing it could turn into terror, that the body could betray the mind in a way that felt like possession. Hydrophobia was the name of the nightmare as it appeared on the surface of the world. And that surface is what mattered, because rabies had an unusually cruel rhythm. After the bite, it could go quiet. Weeks, sometimes months. A long, deceptively peaceful stretch where the body healed and the family tried to forget. The boy limps less. The scar closes. Life returns to chores and school and market days. That gap, this silent interval, was one of the reasons rabies became so feared. It taught communities that danger didn't always announce itself. The virus could be traveling inward long before anyone could see it, moving along nerves toward the brain, turning the body into a road it never agreed to become. To understand why rabies haunted the 1700s and 1800s so intensely, you have to understand how people lived with animals then. Dogs were everywhere. Not the curated, carefully trained pets of modern suburbia, but a spectrum. Lapdogs and hunting hounds, drovers' dogs and guard dogs, stray curs that survived on scraps and the edges of slaughterhouses. In cities like London and Paris, dogs threaded through human life the way smoke threaded through chimneys. Constant, ordinary, unnoticed until it became a problem. In rural villages, dogs were tools and companions at once, necessary for work and woven into family identity. In both worlds, dogs were close enough to love and close enough to fear. And rabies weaponized closeness. It didn't come from a distant swamp or foreign ship. It came from the animal you fed, the animal you trusted around your children. Even when rabies was only sporadic in a town, the possibility of it reshaped behavior. People watched dogs the way sailors watch clouds. They learned a catalog of warning signs. A dog that wandered as if lost in its own head. A dog that snapped without hunger. A dog that seemed to fear light or sound. A dog that drank strangely. or didn't drink at all. They listened for reports of a mad dog, the way later generations would listen for reports of cholera in the water supply. In Britain, rabies was not some rare exotic terror. It was a recurring threat through the 18th and 19th centuries, present enough to remain in public memory and public policy, present enough to flare into panic. In the countryside, it could ripple through animals beyond dogs, cows, horses, sheep, turning a disease of bites into a broader disturbance of farm life and rural security. In towns, a single rabid dog might attack a few people before being killed, but those few bites were more than injuries. They were prophecies, and everyone knew what prophecy meant. You waited. Waiting was the worst part. The bitten person became a living question. Every headache mattered. Every fever mattered. A prickling sensation near the scar could trigger a wave of dread so sharp it made the stomach drop. And dread was contagious. In the 1700s, people didn't separate mind from body the way modern medicine tries to. Fear was not merely psychological. It was physical. It tightened throats. It shook hands. It made sleep thin and haunted. In communities that had survived wars, famines, and epidemics, rabies still had a special kind of terror because it could make a person feel trapped in their own nervous system. So what did people do? They did what humans always do when they don't understand something but must act anyway. They built rituals, remedies, and rules. They searched for control inside chaos. Some responses were practical, even if crude. If a dog was suspected, it might be hunted down and killed quickly. Towns issued proclamations. People tied up animals. In certain periods, authorities leaned on muzzling and restrictions, and those measures became political battlegrounds. Because a muzzle isn't just leather or wire. It's a statement. It says the state can reach into daily life, into private ownership, into the relationship between a person and their dog. By the late 1800s, those debates could turn fierce, with rabies policy becoming a lens for arguments about liberty, class, and authority. But alongside rules, there was desperation. And desperation makes folklore feel like medicine. In parts of Europe, people turned to saints and symbols. One traditional practice involved something known as St. Hubert's key, heated and pressed to the bite site as both spiritual protection and physical cautery. It was a blend of faith and heat, prayer and burning metal, a reminder that in pre-modern medicine the boundary between ritual and treatment was thin enough to tear. In the United States and other places touched by frontier folklore, there was the madstone, a concretion, a stone often said to be found in the stomach of an animal, pressed against the wound to draw out the poison. Families protected these stones like heirlooms. Communities gathered to watch them stick and release, as if the laws of physics could become a verdict on survival. Museums still preserve objects and stories like these because they show what fear does to ingenuity, how it drives people to give shape to the invisible. Doctors, for their part, were not magicians. They were constrained by the knowledge of their time. In the 1700s, many physicians still worked within older frameworks. Humors, miasmas, poisons that entered the body and corrupted it. Rabies didn't fit neatly. It wasn't like plague, which swept through neighborhoods. It wasn't like consumption, which wasted people slowly. Rabies was intimate and sudden at the end, but sneaky at the beginning. So medical practice became a patchwork. Some physicians advocated excision of the wound, some cauterization, some bleeding and purging, some herbal concoctions, some strange experiments borrowed from other diseases because similarity was all they had. The 19th century in particular became a noisy marketplace of proposed cures. Many reported and debated in medical journals, with treatments swinging wildly between the mechanical, the chemical, and the theatrical. None of it offered reliable salvation once symptoms began, and that fact, slowly learned, repeatedly relearned, shaped rabies into a cultural monster. Because rabies does something that feels uniquely cruel. Once the clinical signs appear, it is almost always fatal. That is true now, with modern intensive care, and it was even more true then. In the 1700s and 1800s, hydrophobia wasn't just a diagnosis, it was practically a funeral announcement. So communities built their own early warning systems. Neighbors became surveillance. Children were told not to tease dogs. But children are children, and dogs are dogs, and the world is full of moments where instinct outruns caution. A boy tries to pull a puppy's tail. A drunk man kicks a dog in an alley. Two dogs fight over scraps. Teeth meet skin. And then the countdown begins, even if no one admits it out loud. If you want to understand the emotional weight of rabies in this era, forget the dramatic final stage for a moment and focus on the days between, the suspended life. The mother who watches her child sleep and wonders if the fever is ordinary or prophetic. The father who resents the dog and also misses it because the dog had a name and a history and used to rest its head on his boot. The village that gossips in half whispers, because the bitten family is both pitied and feared. Rabies didn't just infect bodies, it infected relationships. And the dog. What of the dog? In the public imagination, the rabid dog became a symbol of betrayal, a domestic creature turned weapon. But in reality, the animal was also a victim, driven by neurological illness into agitation, confusion, aggression. Modern science would later describe how rabies travels through the nervous system and changes behavior in ways that improve its own transmission, turning biting into a biological strategy. But in the 1700s, people didn't have that framework. They had only the sight of an animal acting wrong, and wrongness often gets translated into evil. This is where rabies intersects with something bigger: the changing relationship between humans and animals across the 18th and 19th centuries. In the early 1700s, a dog was often valued for function, guarding, hunting, herding. By the 1800s, especially in growing cities and among expanding middle classes, dogs increasingly became companions, symbols of domestic life and affection. That shift made rabies even more psychologically devastating. It wasn't just a work animal that turned dangerous, it was a member of the household, and the household was changing too. The 1800s were an era of crowded streets, industrial smoke, and migration into cities. As cities swelled, so did the problem of stray animals. Public health was becoming a concept, but it was still young, still fighting for legitimacy in a world where disease was often understood as fate. Rabies sat right at the intersection of old fear and new bureaucracy. It became the kind of problem that demanded systems: dog control, quarantine, reporting, enforcement. That meant conflict. Owners resisted, reformers insisted. Newspapers amplified every case until a single bite could feel like an epidemic. Meanwhile, in the quieter rooms of science, something was shifting. The 19th century was the century when invisible life began to matter. Germ theory was emerging. Laboratories were becoming temples of a new kind of faith. The faith that nature, even in its cruelty, could be understood. One of the crucial steps was proving that rabies was transmissible through saliva in a way that could be reproduced experimentally. In 1804, the German scientist Georg Gottfried Zinke demonstrated transmission by applying saliva from rabid dogs to animals' tissues, showing that the bite itself wasn't mystical, it was a delivery mechanism. The poison was something physical, something that could be moved, something that could be studied. That kind of knowledge doesn't immediately save lives, but it changes the atmosphere of history. It shifts rabies from curse to problem, from divine punishment to biological phenomenon. And once a horror becomes a problem, humans start asking a different question. Not, why is this happening to us? But how do we stop it? By the 1880s, the search for answers converged on a man whose name would become synonymous with the modern war against microbes: Louis Pasteur. Pasteur was not a doctor. He was a chemist and microbiologist, a man who believed, sometimes stubbornly, that careful experimentation could pry open even nature's most guarded secrets. And rabies, with its delayed onset and nearly certain fatality once symptoms appeared, was one of the most guarded secrets of all. Pasteur and his colleagues developed a method of attenuation, weakening the infectious agent through controlled processes, creating a form of post-exposure vaccination that could, in effect, outrun the virus's slow march toward the brain. This was an astonishing idea for its time, that you could be bitten, exposed, and still be saved if the immune system could be trained fast enough. Then came the moment that turned laboratory work into legend. In July 1885, a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meester was brought to Pasteur after being bitten multiple times by a dog believed to be rabid. His mother pleaded for help. Pasteur hesitated, because if he failed, the boy would almost certainly die. And if he tried, the boy might still die, and the world would say science had played God and lost. But he proceeded with medical collaborators, and the treatment succeeded. Meister lived, and in that survival an ancient terror cracked. It's hard to explain what that meant in emotional terms unless you imagine the generations before it. Centuries of stories ending the same way. The bite, the waiting, the dread, the symptoms, the helplessness. And then, suddenly, a different ending. Not a miracle from the sky, but a miracle built by hands, glass, careful notes, and the courage to try. The impact was immediate and global. Treatment centers based on Pasteur's method spread rapidly. By 1890, clinics existed in cities across multiple continents. The idea that rabies could be prevented after exposure reshaped public health, and it reshaped the cultural meaning of the disease. But here's the thing. The story of rabies in the 1700s and 1800s isn't only the story of a vaccine. It's the story of what fear does to societies before the age of certainty. Rabies taught people to see danger in affection. It turned a beloved animal into a potential executioner. It made communities suspicious of strays, and sometimes suspicious of each other. It fueled folklore and policy, prayer and panic, violence against animals, and also tenderness toward them, because the very fact that dogs were so close to humans made the threat intolerable. It also revealed a grim truth about biology. Nature doesn't care whether you are good. Rabies doesn't strike the wicked and spare the kind. It doesn't negotiate. It follows its rules, and those rules are written in nerves and saliva and time. And yet, in the long arc of history, rabies also became one of the diseases that proved humans could fight back. Not with superstition, not with scapegoats, but with understanding. It became a chapter in the larger transformation of the 19th century, the birth of modern medicine, the moment humanity began to look at invisible killers and say, "You are not a curse, you are a thing, and because you are a thing, you can be stopped." Even today, rabies remains terrifying for the same reason it terrified the 1700s. Once symptoms begin, it is almost always fatal. The difference is that now we know the enemy's roots. We know prevention works. We know vaccines, especially vaccinating dogs, can break the chain that once felt unbreakable. And that knowledge, in a world full of new fears, is a rare kind of comfort, proof that the oldest terrors are not always eternal. So when you look back at a bitten child in a village 200 years ago, don't just see tragedy. See the entire human story wrapped around that wound. The panic in the street, the folk cure whispered by an elder, the doctor with hands that want to help but don't know how, the long weeks of waiting, and then, in a later century, the laboratory where someone refuses to accept the same ending. Rabies began as a bite and became a mirror of our closeness to animals, a mirror of our fear of losing control of our own bodies, a mirror of what happens when science is not yet strong enough and what becomes possible when it finally is. Anyways, I'm Tim, watching the past so we can understand the present, and together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.